Well, thank you for tuning in. We are going to be beginning today a new theme at St Andrews, and that is called "Why Bother with Church?" Why bother with church? And the first little installment of that, we're going to be looking at this for over about 2 months, is foundations. How should we think about church? What is church? And what assumptions, some false, some true, do we have about church? A few years ago, I worked in a church that will remain nameless, and it had a church car park, and there was a tension because the church and the car park were in the center of town, and different people used to use the car park and take up parking bays, and the church always had a struggle trying to say, well, you can park here if you're using the church, or you cannot, and etc., etc., because there was temptation of people to park. And of course, as a church, we didn't clamp cars. One day I was standing in the church car park, and a lady drove her car into the park, and she didn't park in any of the bays. She pulled up, got out of the car, and she saw me, and she walked straight up to me. I wasn't dressed as a vicar then. And she said, "Oh, would you mind if I just parked here for a couple of hours?" And I felt the heat rising in me, and I just wanted to say, "No, sorry, this is the church car park." But I was trying to be nice and polite and everything else. And as I was thinking of an answer to say, she interrupted me. She said, "Just for a moment, I want to let you in on a little secret." And I said, "Okay." And I was intrigued, and I listened, and I stopped, and she said, "I'm quite a churchy person, you know." And inside I had to giggle because, I mean, what does that really mean? And I'm not knocking this person because I'm trying to highlight the assumptions of what people think about church. Perhaps she thought that if she said to me that she was a churchy person, I would let her park in the church car park, as opposed to people who definitely weren't churchy people not being allowed to park in the church car park. And once I told her I was working there as a vicar, she just couldn't stop calling me Reverend, and I said, "Actually, no, my name is Mark. It's fine. You can call me Mark if you like." But it struck me that there's so many different assumptions, cultural assumptions about church. And over lockdown, I was thinking a lot about this strange thing, this weird thing that we call church. Because for so many people these days, it's a foreign concept. When I say the word church to you, what are the first things that come to mind? An old-fashioned building, formality, ritual, priests and robes, etc. Some people have very positive views of church growing up. Some people sadly have very negative views. I knew someone once who, whenever they saw a priest in robes, they would wet themselves. I know that's not the case for everyone. So what is church, and how should we think about church, particularly post this lockdown period? Well, I want to say that if you're looking for the answer of what is church or how we should think about it, if you go back to the Bible, you can very quickly figure out what church is not. And I want to give you just a series of nots to start with. Church is not a building. Church is not a denomination. Church is not a thing you drop in on high days or holidays. Church is not a ritual. Church is not singing hymns or your favorite songs on a Sunday morning. Church is not bells or stained glass windows. Church is not even your favorite Sunday morning YouTube service. Church is not a sermon. These are all cultural constructs related to church, but they're not church. So what is church? Well, the first time that we ever find a word describing church in the Bible is in the New Testament. And Luke uses it in the book of Acts. And it's this word in Greek, ecclesia. And what does ecclesia mean? Ecclesia means a people gathered. And it's actually a very broad word. In Acts chapter 19, Luke talks about a riot that occurred, and loads of people were gathered fighting with one another, etc. And he uses this word, ecclesia. It's a general term for just a people gathered. And I want us all to just get that for the moment. The first and most important point is that a church is about a people gathered. People don't come to church. The church comes to its building. The building might be in a normal conventional church building, for want of a better phrase, a building that people would look at and think, yeah, church. It might be in a hall. It might be in a park. It could be in a school classroom. It could be in a tin shack. It could be on the beach. The people don't come to church. The church, meaning the people, come to its building. But gradually, as the early church grew, this word ecclesia came to mean something more specific than just a gathering of people. You can gather for a football match, that could be ecclesia, or a rock concert, that could be ecclesia. But this word in Greek that came to be translated as church was associated with a very specific gathering. And we see this kind of gathering right the way back in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus chapter 19. And here, the reason I refer to this Exodus chapter 19 is that when in Acts, when Luke records Stephen, the martyr, preaching a sermon, he makes reference to Exodus 19 in his sermon, and when Stephen does this, he uses the word ecclesia. And here in Exodus 19, the Israelites have been rescued by God out of slavery in Egypt, and they are camped in the desert at the foot of a mountain. And God is speaking to them through Moses, who's running back and forth up and down the mountain. And I'll just read to you from Exodus 19, verse 4. God speaks to Moses and he says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." He's saying, you've seen, you were rescued. I did everything. God initiated everything. Verse 5, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." God has rescued them, and he's rescued them for a purpose, a mission, and he makes this prophecy, at some point in the future, you will be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. You will be my treasured possession across the world. And there's a striking contradiction here, because they looked, this group gathered at the foot of the mountain just looked like a ragtag bunch of riffraff slaves. They don't amount to very much. God's got great high hopes for them, but there's nothing in them that looks particularly good. They didn't enact their rescue at all. God initiated the whole thing. And there's always this tension, because even after God parts the Red Sea, at one minute they're singing praises to God, saying thank you for everything he's done. Next minute they're moaning, saying, send us back to Egypt. We don't want to be here. Why did you bring us into the desert? There's always this tension. And they kind of wrestling with God in this all the way. And I mean, that's why they spend 40 years in the desert. And it's interesting. They are the people of Israel. The word Israel, literally, when you break it down, means one who wrestles with God. They were rescued, and by God's intervention, they couldn't have done it themselves, and they could not sustain themselves in the desert. When all they had was God, God is all they have. And this is the second point that I want you to get. The first point of church was a people gathered, but it's more specific than that. You see, these people gathered at the foot of the mountain, whether they like it or not, they are now united by a story that's bigger than themselves. They didn't write their own story. They didn't enact their own salvation. God saved them. He rescued them. They didn't even really want to be there. But they are united by a common story that's bigger than themselves. Now, I'll come back to what that story is, and more specifics about that story next week. But I want you to hold on to that thing. A people gathered that are united by a common story that's bigger than themselves. And that's the first picture that we have of church, the gathering in the whole Bible. Now, fast forward 1400 years later, and you have the first followers of Jesus Christ. And it's interesting when you read the Gospels, you see the relationship between Jesus and John and Peter and Judas and all these other disciples that follow him. And then that relationship is one of great tension. On the one hand, it's wonderful. They love being around Jesus. They follow him wherever he goes. But on the other hand, it's uncomfortable. Jesus is always saying to them, "Ye of little faith," And these guys are always bumbling all over the place. And of course, when Jesus is arrested and tried, they all run for the hills. And Judas betrays him, Peter denies him, etc. Peter denies him, etc., etc. And you get the impression when you read the New Testament that these guys, not in a million years, would have just sat down one day and thought, "Hey, wouldn't it be good to start a church?" No, they encountered a bolt of very uncomfortable lightning called Jesus. And as we see played out from the Easter weekend, they could not have in a million years imagined how their encounter with Jesus would come to a climax with his death on the cross. None of them predicted that, despite Jesus having told them that he was going to, the Son of Man was going to die and rise, Mark 10, etc. None of them could have predicted it. And even after the resurrection, they're petrified. They all seated around in their houses together, fearful that the Romans are going to get them. And Jesus keeps appearing to them, and they petrified. They think they've seen a ghost, etc., etc. And they would all rather be out fishing. At one stage, they just say, "This is far too much. I'm going fishing." And of course, bang, there's Jesus waiting for them on the shore again. And this whole thing, this culmination of birth, life, death, resurrection, ascension, and then we saw Pentecost. It's all completely God initiated. None of those disciples sat down and go, "Hey guys, this would be a good idea." And then we see the early church gathered in Acts chapter 2. And now, like those Jews gathered around the mountain in the book of Exodus, now we have a people gathered that are united by a story, a common story that's bigger than themselves. They didn't write the story. They didn't make the story up. It happened to them, whether they liked it or not. And Jesus gives them this mission, and he says, "I want you to take this story. I want you to be my witnesses to the ends of the earth." And it's an extraordinary vision. They didn't have maps. They didn't have trains and planes and everything else. They didn't know where the end of the earth was. But they set out, these ordinary fishermen set out with an extraordinary vision to accomplish. And they could have only done that by the supernatural power of the Holy Spirit. And they did do that. 2,000 years later, on another side of the world, we're still talking about Jesus. I mean, they got this message to the ends of the earth from such humble beginnings. But I want you to fast forward 2,000 years later. Just keep this thought in mind. We have a people gathered, the church, united by a common story much bigger than themselves. And here today, in 2021, we are at this weird place in church history. 100 years ago, about 92% of people went to mainstream Christian denominations, Catholicism or Anglicanism. Today, attendance is about 4%. And in stark contrast, globally, the Christian faith has exploded in places like Africa and Asia. The faith is exploding, and there's church plants and nonconformist movements all over places like Africa and Asia, and also in the West. But the mainstream denominations are in stark decline. And why this decline? Well, I want to say it's quite simple. If you go to church regularly and engage with church, you actually believe that you're part of a story that's bigger than yourself. You believe that. That's what you accept. If you call yourself a Christian and you engage with the church, not just call yourself a cultural Christian or whatever. If you're actively engaged with the church, then you believe that you're part of a story that's bigger than yourself. And here's the tension. That belief that you're part of a story bigger than yourself is just about the hardest thing for anyone in the modern Western culture to accept. Because everything in modern Western media revolves around the self. There's nothing bigger than you. You are your own story. You get to write your own story. You forge your own path. Be yourself. Love yourself. You are only yourself. You are the center of your own universe. That's the story of today. And I realized this because, it's interesting if you look at, say, marketing strategies for the British Army, for instance. The tagline in the British Army used to be "For King and Country." You fought for a nationalistic idea that was bigger than yourself. But these days, the hardest thing in the world is to get people to sign up to go and fight in a war. So they changed all their marketing strategies. And today, the way the army attracts people to it is the tagline, "Be all you can be." Do you see the difference? It used to be "For King and Country," but now it's all about self-development. Be all you can be. And globally, the highest proportions of people who attend church come out of traditionally culturally marginalized groups. They find it easier to accept this belief because within these groups, there tends to be less self-determination. I don't get time to think. I'm working 3 jobs just for a crust of bread. Just to put some shoes on my children's feet. This is in parts of the developing world. But, and this is what I find so unusual, amazing, is that despite all this less self-determination, then many people in developing nations will go and spend 4 hours in church on a Sunday. 4 hours. Now, here in comfy Jersey, if the church goes on for past an hour and everyone's kind of looking at their watch, getting uncomfortable in their pews. But these people with so much less leisure time are there in church for 4 hours, and they believe that they're part of a story that's bigger than themselves. They have very little self-determination. In the West, and this is a great tension. This is the problem. In the West, the church is still preaching a biblical message that you are part of a bigger story, God's story, and that flies slap bang in the face of what you're being told consciously or subconsciously out there on TV or on your phone. There's never been, at any point in history of the world, more self-determination in the West. In the past, it was only kings and queens that had the amount of self-determination that you have just by owning a phone today. But here's that tension again. Study after study in recent years has shown that regular church attendance is very good for you. Why? Well, again, the answer is simple: because we all crave a common story. We were made for a common story, because a common story gives us meaning and identity and purpose. And when you strip that story away and make it all about the self, there's still going to be a vacuum. And with vacuum, you get all kinds of other sub-stories that tend to filter in. And I'll get back to that. But just note, I mean, the JAMA International Medicine Journal in 2016 found that women who went to any kind of religious service more than once a week had a 33% lower chance of dying during the 16-year follow-up period. And a quote from the study says, churchgoers tend to engage in positive behaviors, including high social interaction and lower rates of alcohol and drug abuse. In addition, religious support and coping are both related to positive outcomes in mental health. Dr. Kevin Manoia from Azusa University says, I would take this one a deeper level and say that a spiritually healthy participation in a local church means that we become permeable and vulnerable to others. I enter into a relationship of mutuality with others. And that mentality reminds me that I am not alone. And it reminds me of my place in God's story. See, we're back to story again. And here research showed that it was deeper than just getting together. Church, unlike the gym or club membership, offers a sense of identity, my place in God's story, and a deeper sense of belonging. Church is often described as a family. And what is a family? Well, it's people with a common story that's bigger than themselves. Howard Friedman, professor of psychology at the University of California, co-wrote a wonderful book called The Longevity Project. And the Longevity Project was a survey over 8 decades of a vast range of people and looking at the characteristics of their lives in depth that made them live longer. What made these people live longer? And there are all kinds of things, but Friedman writes, the values drawn from religious traditions such as respect, compassion, gratitude, charity, humility, harmony, meditation, and the preservation of health seem to predict longevity. Okay, and it's fascinating. It's what religion or religious faith, particularly Christian faith, seem to predict longevity, and this correlates with a vast range of other studies out of Harvard and Time magazine as well. But interestingly, Howard Friedman also writes, and he adds to his comment at the bottom. He says, "But not the dogma preached at the altar." And I read this and I was thinking, that's interesting, isn't it? Because how do you separate the dogma from the values in a church? Where do these values come from? If the church practices what it preaches and the result is respect, compassion, gratitude, charity, humility, and harmony, then how can you distinguish the one from the other? What is dogma? And I'll finish with this question, the question of dogma, because people look at the church and think, I suppose it does a few good things in our community, but all that dogmatic stuff and all that in exclusivity, all that truth speaking, we have the truth, etc., etc. That's not for me. That tends to turn people off, and I think we need to just deal with this thing about dogma, because if I'm saying we have a common story, that is quite a dogmatic statement in of itself. But I want to go a little deeper. You see, probably the most dogmatic statement that you can find in the whole Bible comes from John 14, verse 6. And it's the words that Jesus says about himself. He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me." And I've been in plenty of church services where that verse has been expounded, quite often out of context, as a as a triumphalistic way of saying, yes, we have the truth, and if you don't believe our truth, then you're wrong, but in here we are right. And I want to just go back to that statement sensitively, because when you actually read it, it takes you down a line that's quite scary and should be humbling, not triumphalistic. When the first disciples sitting around Jesus heard that, it humbled them. It didn't make them jump up and go, yeah, we've got the truth and everyone else is wrong. It actually humbles them. Because when you say, what does that really mean? I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. What does that mean? Well, in its simplest form, it's Jesus saying, follow me. But who is me? Well, it's obviously Jesus. Jesus is the one who said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So surely that means when I come into a church, I leave my ego at the door. And that's what we do. Right in the beginning of our service, we say confession. In other words, before we look outwards at the problems of the world, we first look inwards at our own heart. And Jesus, the one who said, love your enemies. And whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. There again, I leave my ego at the door and I examine my own heart first. The gospel is good news and challenging news for my heart first. And Jesus, who said, a new commandment I give unto you, love one another as I have loved you, so that you also must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Do you see? This is the Jesus. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. This is the dogmatic direction you follow. Love your enemies. And suddenly, you start to feel the weight of that statement. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And in my experience, when you have a community of people who are really living like that, dogmatically living like that, then you have a very, very beautiful environment. It's not a perfect environment, because if it was absolutely perfect, it would be heaven, but we're not there yet. But when you have a people who truly live as if Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life, and that way, that direction was truly taking up your cross and following him, and leaving your ego at the door, then you have a very beautiful, beautiful place. It's very hard to separate the dogma, from the values. And let me tell you, there's all kinds of dogma, consciously or subconsciously, out there in the world. And if the dogma of Jesus is really like this, love your enemies, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me, then I choose that dogma any day of the week over all the other dogmas in the world. And I pin my colors to that mast. And Jesus didn't just say these words. And that's the wonderful beauty. The physicality of Jesus is not just words written down like a manual to life. This is the historic occurrence of the Lord of the universe, who laid his life down on a cross, taking the sin of the world on himself. The sin being all the times where I reject the common story bigger than myself for my own story. Yeah? The story that I am the center of the universe. Don't mess with me. I am the center of the universe. Jesus takes all that evil, that sadness, that suffering, that death on himself, so that we can be redeemed and saved. And Jesus fully embodied his words in every way. He fully practiced what he preached. There are loads of other dogmas out there, but this is the dogma that I accept. And so I'll end there. The church is a people gathered, but not just any people gathered. The church is a people gathered with a common story bigger than themselves. And it's a good kind of dogma. Next week we're going to just dig a little deeper into what that common story is. But that's part one. Thanks for listening.